Welcome to session 1 for SIP's Supply Chain Diligence. This is unit PD4. This is for the professional department, and we'll just cover a basic introduction to the unit first. The aim and purposes of the unit. Candidates will be able to understand the impact of globalisation on supply chains, and in addition they will have an appreciation of the financial aspects that impact upon supply chains, such as project finance, mergers, acquisitions, financial measures, corporate governance, legal issues, competition law. So a massive focus there on financial aspects. Many of us will associate diligence with taking over a company, but this unit takes obviously a broader view than simply about mergers and taking over companies. The learning outcomes for the 4 questions. Learning outcome 1 is understand the main implications of globalisation on the supply chain. Learning outcome 2 is aspects of corporate environment and their impact. Learning outcome 3, financial aspects. And finally, learning outcome 4 is about performance measures that can be used in the supply chain. So 4 fairly clear, distinct areas for this unit. The course books, this is the SIP's recommendation. I'm not going to read through these. I personally wouldn't buy any of them. They all cover little bits, but really there isn't one that covers enough of it to warrant purchasing. I think with the study guide, extra readings, looking at past exam questions, that's all you're going to need. So moving on then to learning outcome 1, we'll start understand the main implications of globalisation on supply chain management. 1.1, the learning outcome is critically assess the effect of globalisation has on supply chains, and the indicative unit content is our old friend the steeple analysis, general trends in global trade, global logistics, supply chain vulnerability, ethical sourcing, and the local versus global dilemma, which has been heavily examined at level 4. Steeple factors in global supply chains. I think it's fairly straightforward to give examples from each of the areas: social, technology, economic, environmental, political, legal and ethical. And interestingly, on the new SIPS exam starting in July, they've introduced a steepled with a D at the end analysis, with the D for being demographic. So they're the external factors that we need to consider that impact upon any supply chain, and they're really broad factors from the macro environment. So think of steeple as an external environmental analysis of the macro environment, but a very useful tool. What are the influences and trends in the world? Well, economic powers changing, and there's the BRICS are developing rapidly, and the BRICS are Brazil, Russia, India, China. There's competition for resources, fossil fuels run out, greater levels of political unrest. Management science has been a central project in management studies and thought. However, with its many uncertainties, having a reasoned analysis it makes it difficult. So it's perhaps a more postmodern approach that we need to take. Pressure will mount on companies to rethink their stances on corporate social responsibility, particularly in regard to sustainability. It's a huge influence in all organisations. Logistics, just a simple definition there: process of strategically managing procurement, movement and storage of materials. I'm not sure whether procurement should be included in the definition of logistics. Logistics is mainly transport and movement, but it can encompass a wide breadth of the supply chain. So there's a definition there from Christopher. Issues in global logistics, fairly similar to issues at international trade, culture, education, exchange rates, information availability, differences in infrastructures, over efficient, by that they mean lean with no stock in the system, over vulnerable supply chains, politics of trade, security. So some general issues there that affect global logistics. Transport can be by water, and there are fairly straightforward advantages and disadvantages of that. Transport can obviously be by air, faster, quicker, but lighter weight, etc. And transport can of course be by land or a combination of. So people often use multimodal transport. So part of the journey could be by ship or rail, and then finally by truck. There's some statistics. Next slide that shows in the UK in 2010 how reliant we were on road transport, with 82% of all freight or transport being moved by that method. And there's some general advantages and disadvantages of each method on the next slide here. Fairly basic. Vulnerability, a very important word. It's named on this unit content, and they may use that word in front of the word risk in a question. So vulnerability is the susceptibility to adverse events and trends. It's strictly not a risk, but there is a risk, obviously, that the vulnerability leads to a problem. Risk is the characteristics of the chance and impact of those events, and we'll look at the definition, another definition in a second. And resilience, very important to supply chains, the ability and time needed to recover the supply chain's original shape and level of performance following a disruption. So organisations need resilient supply chains that can withstand a shock to the system and don't simply collapse. So building in resilience is a very important idea in supply chain management. Supply chain vulnerability, there's two definitions here. You do not need them both, but take your pick. Cranfield give it as an exposure to serious disturbance arising from risks within the supply chain as well as risks external to the supply chain. And one here from SIPS, and perhaps easy to remember, that it's a point of weakness and or possible threat to the supply chain network. So learn one of these definitions. The textbook cites a model from Macmillan and Tampo, and it talks about corporate survival, factors that are threats to the organisation's survival. It's basically Porter's 5 forces with a few extra pastel boxes added to it. So it could be useful for revision. The theory is fairly light, but obviously besides the microenvironment, we've got governments, pressure groups, complementary organisations that drift away, fashion, fickleness and change. So a model there just that gives us some of the major threats. What drives vulnerability in supply chains? Well, it can come from demand, environmental factors, supply, processes, mitigation, contingency, control. Christopher and Peck perhaps give us a clearer view of these vulnerabilities in a model we're going to look at shortly, but general areas and causes of vulnerability: fragile earth, lean working, outsourcing, supply rationalisation, distance, etc. So these are all areas or causes of vulnerability. The supply chain needs to be seen as a network, and obviously the complexity of these networks introduces risk. So the larger the number of steps, the greater the chance of disruption. The number of tiers, the greater the distance from our own nodes oversights, and it can be difficult to control the flow of information. So problem areas in supply chains: quality control systems, planning and forecasting, risk management, ethical practices, supplier selection are all key areas. And we come on now to the very, very useful model from Christopher and Peck, which basically summarises the main sources or types of risk that impact on an organisation. And the 5 areas are the external environment, from your supply side, from your demand side, and then we've got the process risk and control risk, which is internal to the organisation. So it's a very useful model. the study guide shows this diagram, which perhaps is not quite as clear as the previous ones, which shows the external there, supply risks, demand risks, and the internal risks within the organisation. So Christopher and Peck actually called it a typology of risk. Dealing with risk or vulnerability really requires a risk management process, and a basic cycle here is shown. This is the same one that's in the level 5 risk management, and the cycle starts with identification through to assessment, formulating strategies, tolerate, treat, etc., allocating resources, implementing it, monitor, report, and start again. So a very simple risk cycle there. And we've got the impact likelihood or probability matrix here, where some risks may be acceptable if the impact's low and the likelihood's low, and unacceptable with high likelihood, high impact. Often organisations will use red, amber, green, and there will be quadrants in this risk analysis, or they'll use a risk register. But visually, the impact likelihood matrix is useful to give us a view on what actions we may take after assessing the one of a slide here that I've produced from the risk management, and it sums up the key ISO 31000 process, that risk is about, or risk assessment is about identifying the risk, analysing the risk, evaluating the risk, and then treating it with tolerate, treat, transfer or terminate. The whole process is a cycle because we've got communication, monitoring, review and feedback throughout the process. So I think that's a very useful graphic of the risk management process, and it's taken directly from the International Standard on Risk Management. So that's a useful slide. So we've got the 4 T's here of risk management: tolerate, accept it, transfer, such as insurance, treat it, which means reduce it through the reducing the impact or reducing the probability or both, or terminate the risk, avoid it. So they're the 4 high level risk strategies, and these apply equally to the supply. So to understand the risk in a supply chain, we need to conduct supply chain mapping. A very important first stage in identifying risks is mapping your supply chain. Determine the interconnecting pipeline of suppliers, manage the transport links by which products are passed, gauge the amount of work in progress and inventory at each stage, predict the time it would take to re-establish the service if there's a disruption, better assess risk, it gives you a clear understanding of a situation, more clearly communicate and discuss vulnerability is a benefit of supply chain mapping, highlight hubs and the over-reliance on particular suppliers, and it helps you more easily redesign or modify the supply chain. So it sounds very basic, but it's very important to understand and map your supply chain. How do we improve the supply chain to improve speed through it? We can, and obviously this will reduce risk and vulnerability. We can streamline processes. We could try and reduce inbound lead times by sourcing to minimise response times, synchronise scheduling, and we may try and eliminate non-value adding time. So there are measures that can be undertaken to improve the time factor in supply chains. There is a graphic here from Christopher which highlights areas that you can are important for making your supply chain resilient. It looks very complicated, however it isn't if we break it down. So to have a resilient supply chain, we need to re-engineer the supply chain by mapping, understanding it, having a risk register, rethinking options. We need to collaborate in the supply chain, so develop supply chain intelligence and cooperative planning. We maybe need agility so we can respond quickly and meet customer demands. And fourthly, we need to create a supply chain management culture. So even though the graphic looks complex, it gives us 4 areas that we can consider that will help make our supply chain more resilient. Globalization is mentioned and named in the unit content. So a good definition, such as the integration of markets in the global economy leading to increased interconnectedness of national economies. And there's an alternative definition on the slide there. The main point is it's not international trade, it's much more than that. It's the key word there was this integration and interconnectedness, that it's all linked together. So a very important concept is globalization, and it's worth looking at these videos. So I'll spend a couple of minutes and drop into these videos. Why do we need to trade globally? Changing markets, to get sourcing advantages, expertise, quality, etc, etc. So many pressures and reasons to trade globally. Stages of globalization. How do we develop globally in an organisation? We need to develop a core strategy, usually start at home, and then we might start to internationalise through new markets. Then we might connect up multiple countries' specific strategies, and eventually we'll rationalise the many connected strategies to develop maybe one few regional and one global strategy. So these are 4 stages mentioned in the study guide. I think perhaps a much more useful model of globalisation is Yip's globalisation drivers, and any good textbook on theories of globalisation will have Yip's theory in. It's in many of the corporate strategy textbooks, and Yip basically says the main influence on globalisation are markets, cost, government and competitive drivers. And we'll consider on the next slide what these drivers are. So customer needs, customers and channels, marketing, leading countries are the market factors. Governments obviously have a major influence, particularly with trade policies, encouraging foreign investment. Costs, so some countries will have cost advantages, and there are competitive globalisation drivers such as interdependence of countries and competitors. So a fairly simple model there on the main factors. It's in the revision notes. They can't ask you about it because it's not named on the content, but you could cite the theory as a major theory that explains the drivers of globalisation. The global institutions that are important in the world and support international trade. There's the International Monetary Fund, there's the WTO, and there's the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, to name 3 institutions. Again, these are not named on the unit content and cannot be examined by name, but if you're talking about general matters of globalisation, they could form part of a very high grade answer. How do companies decide where to locate? Do they locate it in the same country? Do they go offshore? Do they insource or do they outsource? Well, there are 4 quadrants there that explains outsourcing, insourcing, outsourcing, offshoring, etc, etc. Offshoring often involves the decision is to move it offshore. Do we keep it in our own organisation, set up a division, or do we let an external organisation carry it out? And increasingly in America, much product may be reshored, brought back onshore. So a useful summary of the issues there. But obviously there's offshoring problems, pretty much the same as outsourcing. Unpredictable, indecision. It creates risk. There's, as we become more integrated, the global sourcing may move from international purchasing to true global sourcing. So we may start off with an head office procurement buys items, then they seek help of business units over abroad, then offices may be set up, then product design and development as well as sourcing are decentralised, and finally the network of offices is coordinated to produce an integrated global strategy. So this is illustrating moving from simply buying abroad to a fully integrated global sourcing strategy. A question which has been asked a couple of times and is quite a hot question for the March exams is discuss the relative merits of local versus international sourcing. So this slide gives several factors of why we may wish to local source, including obviously the very current problem avoidance of tariffs, shorter supply chains, less resources, it's more environmental friendly, and many straightforward factors. So learn this slide. Arguments for global sourcing, fairly straightforward again. We need access to the best suppliers, we need competitive products, we need high quality, many factors why we need to global source. And there's a useful summary there of the advantages and disadvantages on the same graphic. So the global's got advantages, disadvantages, and local similar. So it's an argument we've encountered before on your SIPS studies, but it has been examined on at least 2 occasions, so make sure you're very familiar with the argument. A typical exam question here is analyse the factors that a purchasing organisation should consider when sourcing globally rather than locally, and what we've got to be careful here is factors that it should consider, not necessarily list advantages and disadvantages, although they're part of the understanding you need to answer the question. So a good answer talked about availability, length of the chain, environmental impacts, agility, cost, quality, payment, etc. So a wide range of issues, but that's a 25 marker. And some more detail there on perhaps what you might talk about under each area. And that gives you some more factors. What is useful here is if you notice theory, you've got to use theory, and the theory that they're throwing here in on factors you should consider, reference to Peck Wild and Wild's sources of risk in supply chains could be mentioned. The steeple analysis could be used to help you answer that. Yip's globalisation drivers could have been thrown in. So make sure that some theory is linked to each of your answers. 1.2 then, this is corporate governance, which is about separation of duties of the executive and the management, ethical practices, breaches of ethical practices, and taking remedial actions when there are ethical breaches. The International Federation of Accountants produce a rather complex view of governance, and it's cited in the study guide, and it is really much too complicated, and they see corporate governance as a smaller area of the enterprise governance, and enterprise governance is more inclusive of corporate governance and performance processes and strategic planning, etc. So there's a subtle difference there between enterprise governance and corporate governance. However, the exam has really only ever gone down the corporate governance view, and I think the enterprise governance overview is far too complex. So why do we need good governance in organisations? Well, it's essential. It can increase market value, better credit ratings, we can be an employer of choice, attract better purchasing staff, better marketing staff. It can make the company attractive to new investors to invest in organisations. So several factors there, but what is more important is you have a basic definition of corporate governance, and it's the system by which companies are directed and controlled, and that was from the Capri Committee in 1992. The governance chain, is an important concept that looks at, from right down at the bottom, the managers and the reports that they will get, right through to the senior executive board, investment managers, trustees, and we can see how the reporting and governance change is different. There's limited reports here, there's investment performance reports here, and the board here will get budgets, targets, qualitative reporting. The executive directors similar, but the managers will get more basic information. So there is a governance chain in all organisations. The governance chains highlights though to whom are the executives responsible, who are the shareholders, what's the role of the investors, what means of scrutiny exist. So why can it all go wrong in governance? Lack of clarity, unequal division of power, perhaps there's an executive with too much power, different levels of access to information, self-interest among the agents, measures and targets reflect agent self-interest rather than those of the end beneficiaries. And there is the UK Governance Code, which gives guidance on good practice on governance of UK organisations, and the basic concepts are highlighted here. So the UK Governance Code, as it's now called, was originally called the Combined Code, and the basic recommendations of the Combined Code and the Corporate Governance Code are that the Chair and Chief Executive's roles need to be split. The Chief Executive shouldn't go on to chair the same organisation. Half the board should consist of non-executive directors, or NEDs as they're called. The board should appoint one independent non-executive director to be the senior independent director. There should be a nomination committee to lead the process of board appointments rather than people just appointing friends ad hocly. The board should describe in the company's report how performance evaluation of the board and its committees and directors have been conducted. Contract period should be set at 1 year or less for notice. There needs to be a remuneration committee to decide levels of pay, and that needs to be made up of non-executive directors. The board should review the effectiveness of internal controls at least annually, and the board should establish an independent audit committee. So some very important provisions there in the combined. More detail there of the principles, and this brings me to a very important area that's been examined several times. The UK Governance Code is born around these principles of leadership, effectiveness, accountability, remuneration, and relations with shareholders. So we can see that there are 5 key principles that the UK Governance Code is based on. Now you can learn these 5 principles as part of the Governance Code and use them in an exam. The alternative is to use the theory that's cited in the study guide from Harris, Crowther and Davis, who detail 9 principles of good governance. Now you don't need them both.
I am definitely going this time.
The 9 principles, which do overlap of course with the UK governance, are rule of law. Governance requires a framework of rules so that rules and regulations are enforced, conflicts and appeals should be resolved and heard by an independent authority. Identity, the organisations needs to be defined and have carried out any necessary registrations and provide details of personnel that take responsibility for decisions. Purpose, power, stakeholders should be treated fairly. Participation, we need effective governance structures, we need transparency, accountability and sustainability. The company should ensure that risks are identified and that its board members and senior managers take decisions to ensure that standards that surround ethical behaviour and environmental standards are not breached. The question will never be list 9 principles. A typical question has been discuss 5 principles or the main principles of a corporate governance. So there's no need to know all 9, but you do need some detail of at least 5. So your choice is to either learn the UK Governance Code, the 5 principles, or these which are discussed in more detail in my revision notes. So very important are the principles. The study guide goes down different governance structures in different countries where you can have single tier boards or 2-tier boards. That's quite a high level discussion, and it differs of course in the United States, UK and Germany and Japan, and we can see a 2-tier board is often in Germany and Japan, but in the UK it tends to be a single tier. And there's some more differences there between the shareholder model and the stakeholder model. It's very high level concepts. This cannot be examined and is unlikely to be examined. And there are benefits and disadvantages of the shareholder model versus the stakeholder model. But I think it's probably to be regarded as padding in the study. Stakeholders in corporate governance, who are they? They're the shareholders, the board of directors, customers, employees, and of course our suppliers, local communities and government. So how do we control risk? Clear specifications, good supply selection processes, contract award processes, goods received, services performed, and payment processes are all important in controlling risk. A procurement process map is mapping obviously procurement processes. Hopefully there'll be a formal governance and ethics code, agreed limits, spend limits, responsibility, checks, disciplinary procedures, rotation of duties, random audits. It's how do we prevent fraud by having good governance and good structures. So some areas there that can be used. The study guide talks about different value chains that some can be very structured where you've got an integrated organisation, and some can be less structured right at the top there where you've got many suppliers and many customers. So there are different ways of organising value chains. Ethical behaviour, fairly straightforward. Acts can be legal and have a legal obligation, but can be legal but not a legal obligation, or they can be illegal but arguably ethical, or they can be illegal. A rather complex way of saying is following the law doesn't necessarily mean you are being ethical. Customer issues regarding ethics, safety, fit of purpose, not making misleading claims, not creating artificial demand, price manipulation, confidentiality, proper usage instructions and training. So there are many customer issues related to ethics, and we've got the fraud conditions here, which obviously to do with ethics. And Sadgrove suggests there are 4 preconditions. Motive, it must be worth stealing, there must be an opportunity, and there must be some lack of control. So they're the conditions that can lead to. So how do we prevent it? Ethical values should be embedded in the organisation. There needs to be training. We need to make sure there isn't too close relationships between purchasers and suppliers, and ensure separation of responsibilities, duties. A fairly basic one is the buyer shouldn't be signing off the invoices, and usually that's the first thing an auditor will insist on to ensure there's good governance. Human rights obviously will lead on to ethics, because human rights are about diversity, equal opportunity and working conditions and practices, and all these are ethical issues. Sources of power in an organisation. This is the French and Raven classic sources, which you'll have studied in the negotiation module. Power can come from your job title. It can be expert power, reward power, referent power and coercive power. And obviously we have to be careful on how power is used and that it's used responsibly. Environmental issues, recovery, recycling, disposal, supply selection, a very wide-ranging set of issues there. Corporate social responsibility, that's named in the content, or at least the ethical sourcing and global dilemma and issues are named. So corporate responsibility is about the triple bottom line. It's about the social and environmental aspects, not just looking at price. So we've got here economic, legal, ethical and philanthropic responsibilities. I think if we think of it as the triple bottom line, it's probably a safer way. Why do we pursue CSR? It can be good. It can be good for business. It saves prosecutions. It builds reputation. It can make us better, more favourable viewed by suppliers, so we can become an organisation of choice. So there are many benefits of pursuing CSR. We've got a slide there on practical CSR, how to implement CSR, high level buy-in, review products. So we need to build sustainability in and ethical practices through from specification to sourcing to contract award, monitor control. So we need to embed it throughout the organisation. CSR in terms of suppliers, involve suppliers. Is the supplier using scarce resources? Are suppliers energy efficient? Does the supplier have ethical employment practices? So we'd be looking at issues such as child labour, forced labour, excessive working hours, and a good answer would perhaps throw in the ETI base code with the 9 principles that are encompassed in that. And we've got the Ethical Trading Initiative now, which is a UK initiative to try and ensure we've got ethical supply chains, and they've developed a base code, and the base code there has got the 9 elements. You really must have a basic knowledge of the ETI base code. So freely chosen, no child labour, so you need to be clear on a definition of child labour. Working hours, so if you look at the guidance, it should say it's 48 hours but 60 hours by exception. No discrimination, regular employment. So there's 9 areas there. You don't need a detailed knowledge, but you do need a basic knowledge of the 9 areas. That's heavily examined in most SIPS units, so very important. There is an alternative standard called SA 8000, which more international companies use than UK, and you can ask your suppliers to be audited against that, and they can be independently accredited. You don't need to learn both, but I think if you learn at least the ETI one, that will serve you well. But missing from the ETI and the SA 8000 are the environment and bribery and corruption. So you could have suppliers that comply with the ETI base code or SA 8000 and they still maybe wouldn't be classed as ethical stroke sustainable, because environmental requirements, pollution, recycling, etc. aren't part of the ETI base code, and neither are aspects of bribery. There is an organisation called SCD, which many UK companies are now using to store data on their audits, and they're a very important player now in supply chains. The Supply Chain Ethics was launched in 2004 and simply aims to improve the effectiveness of buying companies' ethical trade strategies by offering a facility for supply companies to share audits with multiple consumers. So it's not a standard, it is a third-party database that facilitates information sharing in complex supply chains. So if you haven't come across SCD, I would suggest you watch the video in the recommended videos and perhaps just spend 5 minutes brushing up on that. Sustainable products are obviously important, and issues such as reuse and recycling, sustainable sourcing, all there. We may need to do ethical audits, well we will have to do if we've got international supply chains, and we need to ensure they're conducted thoroughly and reports and communication come out of those. Now, if we get ethical breaches, this has been examined and it's named in your unit content, and the unit content basically suggests that you need to know how to deal with ethical breaches. And I'm just looking for the words here. Yeah, the unit content actually says taking remedial action for breaches of ethical practices. So the wrong answer is just get rid of the supplier. That would be perhaps unethical. You need to be have a proper procedure. So identify the problem, frame the issue, collect the evidence, evaluate, interpret the evidence, and reach a conclusion and presentation. So that's a fairly broad overview of a general ethical. More detailed and suggested answer from one of the past papers suggests you investigate in detail the breaches, an early dialogue with the supplier, such as executive or chief purchasing officer, review the level of content of the KPIs and take remedial action, produce a supply chain map to outline vulnerabilities, conduct an audit, need for better auditing, in extreme cases, last resort, exit the supplier. After the acquisition made, international supplier should issue statement indicating the accusations are being taken seriously and immediate action is being taken as the reputation of the food organisation is at risk. Food organisation should check workers of supplier have not been treated badly. Communication with the media will have to be carefully planned. It's slightly scattergun, the answer, but it gives you a broad range of issues that you could discuss. Perhaps a more focused answer is more here on the remedial actions that you could do is, obviously if you've had a problem, you've got to review your procedures and standards. So perhaps you need to implement new procedures. You need to revise the contractual agreements. You may consider joining the Ethical Trading Initiative or some sort of label standard. You might have to delist non-performing contractors, initiate a public relations campaign, and perhaps appoint independent auditors to review the breaches of ethical practice, and so on. A very wide range of remedial action. Measures to reduce unethical behaviour: conduct audits regularly, perhaps unannounced, have a proper code of conduct, develop supply chain wide agreements based on factual investigations, reward good behaviour, re-educate buyers, undertake regular monitoring, and in the public sector, use public procurement legislation to select responsible subcontractors, do early market assessments, create a culture where whistleblowing across the supply chain is encouraged. We move now on to the final learning outcome 1.3, which is critically appraise the integration of systems in globalised supply chains. The unit content suggests the use of systems to achieve control, capturing data on information systems, systems integration within globalised organisations, and systems integration across supply chains. So this can be about information systems with your suppliers and your supply chains. It can be about when companies merge with other organisations and the need to integrate information systems. So there are two broad viewpoints about integration here. Integration of existing supply chain systems, or integration when companies come together and merge. So simple systems theory: systems can be open and closed. Closed system means it's not impacted by the environment and the organisation doesn't impact the environment. More realistically, organisations are seen as part of an open system where the environment impacts the organisation and the organisation also impacts the external environment. A simple system here: inputs, processes, outputs and feedback. So they're the basics of a system. Running an organisational system: typical systems can be in operations, management, planning, organisation, communication and control. And control mechanisms need to be simple, adaptable, capable of choice, decisive, cost effective and acceptable and appropriate for people using it. So they're the features of good control mechanisms. Good quality control of information or good quality information should be relevant. It's actionable, accurate. We don't need it sometimes to 5 decimal points. It's valid. It's consistent. You can use it for comparison. It's timely. It's no good a week later. We want it when we need to make the decision. It's appropriately communicated and it's cost effective. So there are many features of information. Controls at different levels. We have strategic controls for board level processes. We have tactical controls, so more middle management, and then there are operational controls, which can be sort of weekly, daily control. Data that might be shared with suppliers. This has been the theme of at least 3 exam questions. Suggest data you might share with a supplier. Well, it could be data on new product development, it could be data on sales and promotions, data on product costs, market trends, pricing performance, delivery dates, locations, data regarding NPD, specification data, lead time data, review of complaints, any information that you're likely to share, vendor performance reports, new developments. The list is endless, but you do need to be able to suggest data that might be shared. The level of data will depend whether it's a strategic supplier. So a good distinction might be to made as to whether it's a strategic or leverage item. The level of data and detail would be different. The study guide shows a basic slide of integration options for organisations, that they can backward integrate and buy their suppliers, or they can forward integrate and perhaps purchase distributors in the supply chain, or they might horizontally integrate in complementary products. So integration options. An important concept in the study guide with relation to integration is big I and little I, and that's referred to in page 64 of the study guide. Gullidge refers to 2 types of integration. Big I is everyone's on the same system, but little I is a network of reliably interfaced systems. It's highly unlikely we'll ever get everybody in a supply chain on the same system, although with cloud computing perhaps it could happen. So big I is integration implies all data for a particularly bounded and closed set of processes is processed in the same software application. Updates in one application module are reflected throughout the business. So it's not the same as everyone having SAP 3. It means everyone's got the same database that they all integrate with. Little I require interfacing, and these are most relevant for the implementation of enterprise systems, which can be point-to-point integration, database, data warehousing, application service, etc. So very important. Supply chains are predominantly. There's an example of an integrated supply chain, which would be an example of little I, where we've got an organisation there that's communicating with the supply network, and the supply network is information going down to material suppliers. So we've got an example there. What processes do we need to integrate to make it all work together? Well, in a supply chain, these are the key processes: demand planning, customer relationships, order fulfillment, product development, manufacturing customization, supplier relationships, life cycle support and reverse logistics. These are the 8 key supply chain processes. So how do we integrate supply chains? What are the challenges? Well, the key theory for your revision is Wisner, Tang and Liang, and they say, well, the main challenges are about preparing, breaking down barriers, connecting up the systems, developing collaboration measures. Then we need active internal integration, forming intra-organisation teams, communication, sharing information, collaborating, developing new collaboration opportunities. And finally, we need active external integration, where we identify supply chain strategies, identify business process requirements, identify supply chain information systems, and develop external integration performance. There can also be process barriers, since systems need to be built on different platforms and will use different technology. In addition, there can be human barriers, since people can resist change, and these need to be considered as part of any integration challenge. So Wisner, Tang and Liang are very, very important theory for challenges of integrating supply chain. There's a rather complex supply chain integration tool in the study guide, which talks about looking at combination fit, level of integration and synergy realization when you're considering integrating with a new organisation that you're taking over. It really is a very complex model and difficult to understand. I've done a more detailed explanation in the study notes, but I feel it's not a useful tool that's going to help you in your exam. Perhaps more useful is we might benchmark processes, and we might see when we take over an organisation who's got the best process, and it may be that we adapt the better process from the two organisations. So how can we benchmark procurement? Well, basic processes, procurement, requisition to pay, technology, etc. There are 6 key processes here that we might benchmark. How might we merge different cultures when we're joining up with a new organisation? Well, there are 4 basic strategies. We could completely assimilate the new company, where the acquired company embraces the firm's culture, and that works well if they've got a weak culture. We might try deculturation, where the acquiring firm imposes its culture on the unwilling acquired firm. The acquired firm's culture doesn't work, but employees don't realise it. Then there's integration, combined to a new culture, and that improves both cultures. Or perhaps you keep the cultures separate, and they keep their separate cultures and operate as they have been doing. So, a rather complex but very useful model for merging different cultures. Finally, then we come to the exam analysis, which you can see there are only 3 learning outcomes, and they're very good at rotating around. 1.2 was examined in January, 1.2 in November, 1.1 in July, 1.3 was last time examined in May, and if we go back further, 1.3 was examined in May of 2017, January 2016. So we can see that 1.3 will be usually examined at least once every year, although March and July are the last time these will ever be examined. So my hot tips would be 1.3, followed closely obviously by 1.1. Having said that, there are only 3 learning outcomes. I've pulled out some questions here which I think are likely to come up. I've done a more detailed analysis on a Word document which I will supply to you, but these are the hot questions on point of view they've not been examined 4 times perhaps, or they've not been examined more than once. The January 19 question, that was the 4th time it's been examined. So the key to passing this is to review all past questions, and I've produced a much simplified analysis of all the questions which I will forward via email. So we've got 1.1 there that's only been examined twice, and that's a question about factors you should consider when sourcing globally rather than locally. July 14 has never been repeated, so that's obviously a very dangerous question that could come up. 5 supply chain vulnerabilities. May 15 has never been repeated, I personally think it won't be, because it's now a rather dated report of 2014, and perhaps that would be difficult to re-examine. The one I think will probably come up is 1.3, which would be its fourth outing, but 1.3 is due to come up by rotation, and that is 5 examples of data that can be shared and discuss the challenges to successful systems integration. And finally, a 1.2 question that's only been asked twice, and that's 5 measures that a company should take to reduce the likelihood of unethical behaviour in supply chains. That said, 1.2 has been asked the last twice, so I think that's unlikely. It's only included because it's only been examined twice previously. So I hope that gives you a good overview. There are only 3 sections: 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and 1.3 is very distinct. It is about systems integration. There has only ever been really 2 different types of question on that one of which I've put on this paper. But if you review those questions, you should be in a good place. So that brings us to the end of this presentation, and the next session we'll look at will be section 2, which starts in chapter 6 in the study guide. We've basically covered chapters 1 to 5 in the study guide in this session. Section 2 will cover chapters 6, 7, 8, 9 and some of 12. It's a little scattergun. And section 3 covers chapter 10, chapter 14 and 15. It jumps around a bit, does the study guide. So thank you, and I'll speak to you shortly.